Hello, I'm John McGovern, and today I'm going to be discussing the first book of Edmund Spenser's allegorical poem, The Faerie Queene. The main characters of Book 1 are the Red Cross Knight, who wears the badge of St. George, hence his name, the Red Cross, and Una. I might mispronounce this, Una, throughout the video, but it should be Una, who represents truth. And these two companions are on a quest because the Red Cross Knight has been commissioned by the Faerie Queene to defeat a terrible dragon. But the main action of the book revolves around things not going quite to plan and various digressions and problems. The first thing that happens is that while Red Cross and Una are traveling, there is a terrible storm, and in order to avoid this storm, they enter a wood. But this is not just an ordinary wood, it's known as the Wandering Wood, and soon the two characters completely lose their way, and they wend their way to it's called a loathsome hole, called Error's Den, and Una begs the knight not to enter, but he goes in anyway, and he encounters a terrible creature called Error, and Error is described as a serpent-woman hybrid, and ultimately Red Cross defeats her by beheading her. And when Red Cross and Una leave the den, they follow the path they took back out of the wood, and they vow never to go in there again. But then things start to be going smoothly again. But at that moment they encounter an old man. They don't know this, but it's really an evil wizard called Archimago in disguise. So Archimago means something like the arch image maker. So he's a master of disguise and of deception. And they follow Archimago to his house, and there Archimago plans his next trick. Archimago trains a wicked spirit to resemble Una. And this character is sometimes called False Una, and the plan is to seduce Red Cross Knight. So this False Una tries to capture the affections of the Red Cross Knight, but he stays strong to his principles and rejects her advances. But not to be defeated so easily, Archimago then trains a second spirit to resemble a squire, and he puts the two spirits in bed together, and he summons Red Cross Knight to see the two in flagrante delicto. And Red Cross is horrified by what he sees, because he thinks it signifies that Una is not the pure maiden that he thought she was, and in consequence he abandons the real Una, who is really just an innocent victim of this trick. And Spenser describes Una the next morning when she realizes she's been abandoned. He says, "Now when the rosy-fingered morning fair, weary of aged Tithony's saffron bed, had spread her purple robe through dewy air, and the high hills Titan discovered, the royal virgin shook off drowsy head, and rising forth out of her baser bower, looked for her knight, who far away was fled, and for her dwarf that wont to wait each hour. Then gan she wail and weep to see that woeful stour." And in some respects, this passage resembles a scene in Virgil, which describes Aeneas's abandonment of Dido. The real Una is initially helpless, but soon she comes under the protection of a courageous lion. But sadly, the lion himself is ultimately killed by a pagan knight called Saint Lois. There are three pagan brothers called Saint Lois, Saint Joie, and Saint Foix. So with lawlessness, faithlessness, and despondency. There's some doubt about how these would have been pronounced in the Elizabethan period, in the kind of bastardized French which was used in England's law courts, for example. French was pronounced in quite an anglicized way, so it's possible this was actually supposed to be Sans Joy, Sans Loy, and Sans Foy. But anyway, these are three pagan knights in the poem. Meanwhile, the Red Cross Knight ends up traveling to the House of Pride, and he becomes captive to a giant called Orgoglio, which is the Italian word for pride. Redcross is rescued by Prince Arthur, who leads him to the Well of Life, and Redcross is energized by this, and then he goes on to defeat the dragon, which was the purpose of the entire quest, and then he is married to Una, which is the conclusion of the book. So that's the basic story, shall we say, of book one. But remember, this is an allegorical poem, so we're not just dealing with a literal fairy story. There's also some deeper significance. So what do these events symbolize? One of the key principles of Renaissance allegory is that it was supposed to be multi-layered or multifunctional. This process was described by many authorities, including John Harrington. So broadly speaking, there are two significances of book one, and these can be categorized as the moral allegory and the historical allegory. So in one sense, book one is symbolizing a Christian's eventual triumph over vice, and on the other hand, it's representing historical events. And the main framework of the moral allegory was set down by John Ruskin in 1853, and although this has been more nuanced brush strokes have been added to this over the years, but really Ruskin's main framework still stands. So as Ruskin explained, Redcross Knight represents holiness in the abstract, Una represents truth in the abstract, Archimago represents hypocrisy, Sang-Froid represents infidelity, Sang-Lois represents lawlessness, we already said these, Sang-Joie represents despondency, Orgoglio represents carnal pride, and Duessa represents falsehood. If you keep this in mind when you read the poem, you can get some sense of how Spenser operates. So, for example, when the Red Cross Knight defeats Sang-Joie, this symbolizes a Christian's refusal to give way to despondency. But then, when he is convinced by Duessa to drink from a fountain which robs him of his strength, and then shortly afterwards is captured by the giant, this symbolizes the fact that trusting in falsehood leads to carnal pride. So there's a didactic function of the poem, which is the idea was that a Christian could read this and actually get some assistance in how to navigate his life and how to live his life in a way which pleased God and which was the most effective for him. But while this moral allegory is going on, there's also the historical allegory. And it might be sensible to think about the poem as operating on different frequencies at the same time. So on one frequency, Spenser is sending out a certain message, but then on another frequency, he's sending out quite a different message. The historical allegory represents the events of the English Reformation as told by John Foxe, the Elizabethan chronicler. The initial harmony between Redcross and Una at the start of the book represents supposedly primitive Christianity in England before the age of papal supremacy. So as far as Foxe and Spenser were concerned, this was a purer form of Christianity than that which was later introduced. And then the descent into the Wandering Wood represents the proliferation of doctrinal debates which happened shortly after the coming of the Normans into England. The defeat of error represents the Act of Supremacy passed in 1534, which famously made Henry VIII the supreme governor of the Church of England. Red Cross Knight's abandonment of Una symbolises Henry VIII's abandonment of religious reform after the supposed adultery and then the execution of Anne Boleyn, who was seen by Foxe as a champion of Protestantism. The lion represents Thomas Cromwell, and when the lion defeats a church robber called Kirk Rapine, this symbolises Cromwell's dissolution of the monasteries, which it was commonly thought by the Elizabethans, whether rightly or wrongly, that Cromwell was the mastermind of the dissolution. And then the final defeat of the dragon and the marriage between Redcross and Una symbolises the accession of Queen Elizabeth and the religious settlement of 1559, which restored Protestantism in England after the reign of Mary I, and from Spenser's point of view, marked the providential conclusion of half a century of religious strife and turmoil. So that gives you some sense of the plot of Book 1, and also of the moral and historical allegory which lies beneath the literal story. So I hope that gives you some framework for your reading as you go through it. This is just a general overview, but as you will see, things can get much more complicated than this. Once you start focusing on the individual local details, things can become slightly more bewildering and more complex, but also more entertaining as well. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video, which of course will be a discussion of Book 2 of the poem.